My neighbor called CPS because my kids played outside. She's the one who got arrested instead. I bought this house 3 years ago specifically for the huge backyard. My kids were 6 and 8, and after being stuck in apartments their whole lives, they finally had space to run around. We had this whole routine where they'd come home from school, grab snacks, and play outside until dinner. They built forts with sticks, had water balloon fights, and played tag with the neighborhood kids. It was literally what I'd dreamed about when I saved for the down payment. The house next door was a rental that had been empty for months when I moved in. Then Diane moved in. First day she introduced herself. She seemed normal. Brought over store-bought cookies, talked about how quiet the neighborhood was, mentioned she worked from home doing medical billing. I told her I had 2 kids and she said she loved children. That lasted exactly 4 days. The first complaint came when my kids were playing freeze tag with 3 other kids from the street. Diane came out and told them they were being too loud. It was 4 p.m. on a Tuesday. My son said sorry and they tried to play quieter. Next day, she complained about them using sidewalk chalk on my own driveway because the colors were ugly. Then she said their bikes on the lawn looked trashy. Then she didn't like them eating popsicles outside because it attracted bees. Every single day there was something. She started taking photos of them playing and sending them to our landlord saying they were destroying property. The landlord called me confused because the photos just showed kids playing basketball on the hoop I installed. Then she called the cops saying my kids were unsupervised. The officer showed up while I was literally sitting on the porch watching them. He apologized and left. She called 3 more times that month. The cops stopped coming. Then she escalated to calling CPS. The caseworker showed up and I almost lost it. She had to investigate a report that I was neglecting my children by letting them play outside without proper supervision. My 8-year-old was riding her bike in our driveway. The caseworker looked around, saw my kids were clean, fed, happy, and playing safely in their own yard. She closed the case immediately but warned me someone was repeatedly calling. 2 days later, another CPS visit. This time the report said my kids were malnourished because they were eating lunch outside. They were having sandwiches on the picnic table. The caseworker was the same one and she was getting annoyed too. After the 3rd CPS visit in 2 weeks for my son using a jump rope too loudly, I was done. Turns out Diane didn't just hate my kids. She called animal control on the family with the beagle across the street. She reported the elderly couple behind us for their garden gnomes being eyesores. She complained about every single family on our street. But here's what she didn't know. Our landlord was actually my cousin Rich, who owned 5 properties on this street. I'd never mentioned it because why would I? Rich was already annoyed about her constant complaints about my kids. When I told him about the CPS calls, he was furious. But we needed more. So I started being the perfect neighbor. Every time Diane was outside trying to work on her laptop on her patio, my kids suddenly needed to practice their recorder songs from music class for homework. When she complained, I sweetly said, education comes first. When she'd have her book club over, we'd choose that exact time to test out the new bubble machine I got the kids. Completely legal, our own yard, but she'd get so mad. She started calling CPS twice a week. Different complaints each time. Kids were too dirty from playing. Kids were too clean, so I must be neglecting them emotionally. Kids were too happy, so something suspicious was happening. The caseworker started documenting everything as harassment. Then came the HOA meeting. Diane showed up even though she was a renter, not an owner. She brought a whole presentation about implementing quiet hours from 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. for children. She actually made slides. The HOA president asked if she was serious about banning kids from playing during after-school hours. She said children were ruining property values. That's when Margaret from 2 houses down stood up and said actually, the constant false CPS reports and police visits to Diane's rental were what was concerning buyers. She knew because her sister had tried to buy the house for sale next to Diane, but backed out after seeing all the drama. 3 other families confirmed they'd been harassed by Diane. Rich stood up and said as the property owner, he'd received over 40 complaints from Diane in 3 months, all of them ridiculous. The room went completely silent after Rich finished speaking. I watched Diane's face turn bright red as every single person in that HOA meeting stared at her. She looked around the room like she couldn't believe what was happening. Valerie Hudson cleared her throat and shifted some papers on the table in front of her. She asked if anyone else had documentation of issues with Diane. Suddenly half the room was raising their hands with phones and papers. People were actually standing up to show they had stuff to share. I felt this wave of relief wash over me because I wasn't alone in this. Other families had been dealing with her too. Sebastian Romero stood up first. He pulled out this thick folder with printed emails. He explained that Diane had reported his beagle to animal control 6 times in just 2 months. The complaints were all about barking during normal daytime hours. He showed the emails to Valerie and she passed them around. The animal control officer had eventually told Sebastian they were closing all future complaints from Diane's address. They said it was harassment because the dog was completely normal and just barked sometimes like dogs do. Diane crossed her arms and stared at the wall. She wouldn't look at Sebastian or anyone else. Mark and Kathy Fowler went next. Kathy pulled out her phone and started showing photos of their garden gnomes. They've had those gnomes for like 15 years. Diane had claimed the gnomes broke neighborhood rules about ugly decorations. The Fowlers had certified letters that Diane sent them demanding they remove the gnomes from their own property. Mark explained that the HOA had already told Diane there were no restrictions on lawn decorations. But she kept complaining anyway and sent 3 more letters after the HOA said no. Kathy's hands were shaking a little as she held up her phone. You could tell this whole thing had really stressed them out. 3 more families stood up after that. Each one had similar stories about Diane's harassment over totally normal activities. One family showed photos of their kids riding bikes in their own driveway. Diane had complained that the bikes were too loud and left tire marks. Another family had documentation about a backyard barbecue they hosted. Diane called the police saying the smoke was a health hazard, even though they were just grilling burgers. Someone else had printed text messages where Diane complained about how they parked their car on their own driveway. She said the angle was ugly and made the street look bad. Valerie was taking notes on everything while Diane just sat there with her arms crossed. She refused to speak or defend herself. Her face was still red and she kept looking at the exit like she wanted to run out. Valerie put down her pen and looked directly at Diane. She announced that based on all the evidence presented, the HOA would not be implementing any special quiet hours. Furthermore, they were documenting this whole pattern of harassment for potential legal action if it continued. Diane suddenly stood up so fast her chair scraped across the floor. She called everyone terrible neighbors who didn't understand proper community standards. Then she grabbed her laptop and her presentation materials and stormed toward the door. People actually started clapping as she left. Not like mean clapping, but more like relieved clapping. The door slammed behind her and everyone kind of exhaled at the same time. After the meeting ended, Rich came over and pulled me aside. Sebastian and the Fowlers joined us near the back of the room. Rich explained that as Diane's landlord, he now had documented evidence of her harassing multiple neighbors. This violated her lease terms about being what he called a nuisance tenant. He said the lease had specific language about not disturbing other residents or creating problems in the neighborhood. With everything from tonight plus all his previous documentation, he had grounds to take action. Sebastian asked what that meant exactly. Rich said he was going to talk to his real estate attorney about starting the process to get her out. Rich scheduled a meeting with his lawyer for the next morning. I went home that night feeling hopeful for the first time in months. My kids were already asleep when I got back. I checked on them and they looked so peaceful. The next afternoon, Rich texted me while I was at work. His lawyer had confirmed that all the harassment documentation gave him solid grounds to end Diane's lease early. The attorney was already working on drafting a 30-day notice to vacate. Rich said the paperwork would be ready by the end of the week. A process server would deliver it to make sure everything was legal and official. I showed the text to my coworker and she actually hugged me. She'd been hearing about this whole mess for months. 2 days later, I was home making lunch when I saw a car pull up to Diane's house. A guy in business clothes got out holding an envelope. I moved to my kitchen window where I could see better. Diane was working on her patio like she always did. The process server walked up and handed her the envelope. She took it and he said something to her. She opened it right there and started reading. Her face went from confused to angry in about 5 seconds. She started yelling at the server guy, but he just walked back to his car. She was still yelling as he drove away. That evening, I found a note taped to my front door. It was from Diane. The note said this was all my fault and I had ruined her life. She called me a bad mother and said my kids were brats. I didn't even get upset. I just took photos of the note from every angle with my phone. Then I texted the photos to Rich and to the CPS caseworker. The caseworker responded within an hour saying she was adding this to her file. Diane's harassment actually got worse during her notice period. She called the police twice in 1 week claiming my kids were on her property. Both times my kids were clearly playing in our own yard. I was right there watching them. The responding officers were the same ones who had come before for her other calls. They recognized me and looked tired when they got out of their car. One of them told Diane that filing false reports was illegal. He said they wouldn't respond to future calls from her address unless there was an actual emergency. Diane argued with them, but they just got back in their car and left. She stood on her patio glaring at my house for like an hour after that. 1 week into the 30-day notice period, I was inside making dinner. The kids were playing outside on their swing set in the backyard. I had the window open so I could hear them. Suddenly I heard screaming. Not kid screaming, but adult screaming. I dropped the spoon I was holding and ran to the back door. Diane was in our backyard standing right next to the swing set. My daughter was crying and my son looked scared. Diane was shouting that they were making too much noise. She said she was going to make sure we got kicked out of our house too. Her face was red and she was pointing her finger at my kids. I pushed open the door and ran outside. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and hit the emergency call button while keeping my eyes on Diane. My hands were shaking, but I managed to start recording video at the same time. I pointed the camera right at her standing there in our backyard next to the swing set. My daughter was still crying and my son looked frozen in place. I told them to go inside the house right now and my voice came out louder than I meant it to. They both ran toward the back door and had to go around Diane to get there. She didn't move out of their way. My son grabbed his sister's hand and pulled her past while Diane just stood there with her arms crossed. The second Diane saw me holding up my phone recording her, she started screaming that I was harassing her. She said I had no right to film her and she was going to sue me. I told her she was on my property without permission, and I was calling the police. She said she had every right to be here because she was enforcing neighborhood standards. I kept the camera on her and walked closer to make sure I got a clear shot of her face and where she was standing. She took a step toward me and pointed her finger at my face. She said my kids were destroying the peace of this neighborhood and someone had to do something about it. I could hear the 911 operator answering on my phone. I told them I needed police at my address because my neighbor was trespassing in my backyard and refusing to leave. The operator asked if anyone was in danger, and I said my kids just ran inside scared because this woman was yelling at them. Diane heard me talking to the operator and started yelling even louder. She said I was lying and making things up just like I always did. She said she was the victim here and everyone on this street was against her for no reason. The operator told me to stay on the line and officers were on their way. I asked Diane one more time to leave my property. She said no. She planted her feet and crossed her arms again. She said she wasn't going anywhere until the police came and heard her side of the story. The police car pulled up in front of my house exactly 9 minutes later. I was still in the backyard with Diane and still recording everything on my phone. 2 officers got out and came around the side of the house into the backyard. One of them was the same officer who had responded to Diane's false calls before. He looked at me and then at Diane, and I could see him recognize the situation immediately. He asked what was going on, and I explained that Diane had come into my yard while my kids were playing and started yelling at them. I said I asked her to leave multiple times and she refused. Diane interrupted me and started talking over me. She said the children were being too loud and she had a right to enforce quiet hours. The officer held up his hand and told her to wait her turn. He asked me if I wanted to press charges for trespassing. I said yes. Diane's face turned red and she started arguing with the officers. She said this was her neighborhood too and she had rights. The second officer explained that she was on private property without permission, and she needed to return to her own property immediately. Diane said she wasn't leaving until they understood that I was the problem. She said I was a bad mother who let my kids run wild and disturb everyone. The first officer asked her again to go back to her house. She said no. She actually said the word no directly to a police officer. The officer told her this was her last warning before they would have to take action. Diane said she didn't care about their warnings because she was standing up for what was right. The first officer looked at his partner and they both nodded. He told Diane she was under arrest for trespassing and disturbing the peace. Diane's mouth dropped open like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She said they couldn't arrest her for trying to keep the neighborhood peaceful. The officer took out his handcuffs and told her to turn around and put her hands behind her back. Diane took a step backward and said no again. She said this was wrong and they were making a mistake. The second officer moved to her other side and they both told her she needed to comply. Diane tried to pull away when the first officer reached for her arm. She jerked her whole body backward and almost fell over. She started screaming about how everyone on this street was conspiring against her. She said we were all terrible people who didn't deserve to live in a nice neighborhood. She said we were abusing our children and she was the only one brave enough to report it. The officers each took one of her arms and turned her around. She kept trying to twist away from them, but they held on. She was yelling that we were all liars and she had evidence of everything. She said CPS would believe her and we would all be sorry. The first officer got the handcuffs on her wrists while she was still screaming. She said this was police harassment and she was going to sue the entire police department. The officers started walking Diane toward the front of the house with one on each side of her. She was still yelling the whole way. I followed behind them, still holding my phone up recording. When we got to the front yard, I saw Sebastian coming out of his house across the street. The Fowlers were standing on their porch watching. A couple other neighbors I didn't know as well were looking out their windows. My kids were pressed against our front window watching everything. My daughter's face was all red from crying, and my son had his arm around her. I lifted my hand and waved at them to show them I was okay. My daughter waved back, but she still looked scared. The officers walked Diane to their patrol car, and one of them opened the back door. Diane said she refused to get in. The officer put his hand on top of her head like they do on TV and guided her into the back seat. She was still yelling about conspiracies and abuse even as they closed the door. I could see her mouth moving through the window, but I couldn't hear the words anymore. Sebastian walked across the street toward me and asked if I was all right. I said I was fine, but my kids were pretty shaken up. The Fowlers came down from their porch and Kathy gave me a hug. She said she was so glad the police finally did something. I spent the next hour and 10 minutes sitting at my kitchen table with the first officer. He had a notebook and was writing down everything I said. I told him the whole story from the beginning, starting with when Diane first moved in. I told him about all the complaints and the CPS calls and the HOA meeting. I showed him the video I just recorded of Diane in my backyard. Then I pulled up the photos I had of the note she left on my door. The officer asked if I had any other documentation, and I said yes. I went to my desk and got the folder where I kept everything. I had printouts of the CPS caseworkers' reports that showed all of Diane's calls. I had the emails from Rich about her complaints. I had photos of my kids just playing normally that showed there was nothing wrong. The officer looked through all of it and kept making notes. He said this was clearly a pattern of harassment. He said combined with her behavior tonight and her refusal to follow police orders, Diane would be facing multiple charges. He said I should expect to be contacted by the district attorney's office about pressing charges. I asked what would happen to her, and he said that depended on a lot of things, but at minimum, she would have to go to court. He said her refusal to comply with police orders made things much worse for her. He finished writing his notes and gave me a case number. He said to call if Diane tried to contact me or come near my property again. After he left, I checked on my kids. They were in the living room watching TV but not really paying attention. I sat down between them and told them everything was okay now. My daughter asked if the bad lady was going to come back. I said no, the police took her away and she wouldn't be bothering us anymore. My phone rang around 8 that evening while I was cleaning up from dinner. It was Rich. He said he heard about what happened from Sebastian and wanted to know if we were okay. I told him we were fine and explained everything that happened with Diane in the backyard and the arrest. Rich said he couldn't believe she actually got herself arrested. I said I had it all on video if he needed it. He said he definitely wanted a copy because his attorney was going to love this. He said he had already called his lawyer after he heard, and they talked about the situation. His lawyer told him that since Diane committed a crime on the rental property, they had grounds for immediate eviction instead of waiting out the 30-day notice. I asked how fast immediate meant, and Rich said his lawyer was drafting new paperwork tonight. He said they could require her to be out in 7 days instead of 30 because of the criminal activity. I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me. Rich said his lawyer would have the papers ready by morning, and he would serve them himself to make sure it was done right. He said to expect Diane to lose it when she got the notice, but not to engage with her at all. He said to call the police immediately if she came near my property, or tried to contact me. I thanked him about 100 times, and he said this was long overdue. The next morning I was making breakfast when I saw Rich's truck pull up in front of Diane's house. It was around 9:30. I moved to the living room window where I could see better. Rich got out holding a manila envelope and walked up to Diane's front door. He knocked and waited. After about a minute, Diane opened the door. She was still in her bathrobe. Rich held out the envelope and said something I couldn't hear from my house. Diane took the envelope and opened it right there on her doorstep. I watched her pull out the papers and start reading. Her whole face changed as she read. She looked up at Rich and her mouth was moving fast. She looked angry and upset at the same time. She held up the papers and shook them at Rich. He just stood there calm with his hands in his pockets. Diane threw the papers on the ground right in front of him. She said something else and pointed at my house. Rich bent down and picked up the papers. He took out his phone and took a picture of the papers on the ground. Then he took a picture of Diane standing there. She screamed something at him and went back inside and slammed the door. Rich walked back to his truck and sat in the driver's seat for a minute doing something on his phone. Then he drove away. I texted him asking if he was okay, and he said yeah. She reacted exactly how he expected. He said he got photos of her throwing the notice on the ground, which his lawyer said was good evidence of her refusing to comply with the eviction. 2 days later, I was at work when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was the CPS caseworker. She said she wanted to let me know that she was officially closing my case. I felt my whole body relax when she said that. She said she was putting a notation in the file that all the reports were malicious harassment by a neighbor who has since been arrested. She said this documentation would prevent anyone from taking future calls from Diane seriously if she tried to call again. She apologized for everything my family had to go through. She said she could tell from the first visit that the reports were false, but she still had to investigate each one. I told her I understood and I appreciated her documenting everything. She said she wished more cases were this clear-cut. She said usually it's hard to prove harassment, but with Diane's arrest and all the other evidence, this was obvious. I thanked her and hung up feeling lighter than I had in months. That evening, I told my kids that the lady from CPS called and said we passed all her checks. My son asked if that meant no one would come check on us anymore. I said that was exactly what it meant. My daughter asked if we could play outside without worrying, and I said yes, we could play outside whenever we wanted. 7 days after Rich served the new eviction notice, I woke up to the sound of a truck engine. I looked out my bedroom window and saw a moving truck backing into Diane's driveway. It was 6:30 in the morning. I got dressed and made coffee and kept watching from different windows. Around 7, 2 guys got out of the truck and went to Diane's front door. She let them in, and I could hear her voice from inside my house even with the windows closed. She was yelling at them about something. The guys came back out carrying boxes and furniture. Every time they came out, Diane was right behind them telling them to be careful. I could hear her saying things like, "Watch the corners and don't scratch that." The guys looked annoyed. Rich showed up around 8 with another man in a suit who I guessed was his lawyer. They parked on the street and just watched from Rich's truck. More neighbors started coming out as the morning went on. Sebastian was on his porch drinking coffee. The Fowlers were in their front yard pretending to check their mailbox, but really watching. I went out on my porch with my own coffee and sat in one of my chairs. The moving guys kept loading the truck for hours. Every piece of furniture, every box, every bag. Diane supervised everything and kept yelling instructions. Around 11, my kids came outside and asked what was happening. I told them Diane was moving away. My daughter asked if she was ever coming back, and I said no, she was leaving for good. By 3 in the afternoon, the moving truck was almost full. The guys were loading the last few boxes. Diane was standing in her driveway with her arms crossed, watching them. She kept looking over at my house with this angry expression. Rich and his lawyer got out of the truck and walked over to Diane. Rich held out his hand for something. Diane reached in her pocket and pulled out keys. She threw them at Rich instead of handing them to him. He bent down and picked them up off the driveway. The lawyer said something to Diane and pointed at his clipboard. Diane signed something without looking at it. The moving guys closed up the back of the truck and got in the cab. The truck pulled out of the driveway and drove down the street. Diane walked to her car and opened the driver's door. Before she got in, she turned and looked directly at my house. She stared at me sitting on my porch for a long moment. Her face was full of hate. Then she got in her car and started the engine. She backed out of the driveway and drove away in the same direction as the moving truck. I watched her car until it turned the corner and disappeared. Rich walked across the street to my porch. He said she turned in the keys and he was changing all the locks today. He said he was also installing security cameras on the property to document the condition in case Diane tried to claim they damaged something. I asked if he thought she would try anything else, and he said probably not, but he wanted to be safe. He said his lawyer was keeping all the documentation in case Diane tried to sue, but he doubted she would. He said people like her usually just move on to the next place to complain about. I thanked Rich for everything he did, and he said that's what family is for. He said he was sorry it took so long to get rid of her, but at least it was finally over. That evening, I opened the back door and watched my kids run outside with huge smiles on their faces. My daughter grabbed her jump rope and my son got his basketball from the garage. They played in the backyard while the sun started going down, and I sat on the porch without feeling that knot in my stomach every time they made noise. Sebastian came over around 7 with his beagle, and the dog ran around chasing the kids while they threw a tennis ball across the yard. The beagle barked and jumped, and nobody complained or took photos or called anyone. Mark and Kathy walked over from their house carrying a plate covered with aluminum foil, and Kathy said she baked chocolate chip cookies to celebrate Diane being gone. We sat on the porch eating cookies while the kids played, and the beagle ran in circles, and it felt like the whole street was breathing easier. Other neighbors came outside too, and kids from down the block showed up to play, and suddenly my backyard was full of children again like it used to be. My son asked if they could stay outside until dark, and I said yes without even thinking about it. We stayed out there until almost 9, and the kids caught fireflies in jars, and the beagle tried to catch them too, but just ended up running into the fence. Over the next few weeks, everything went back to normal. Kids played outside after school every day, and nobody complained about the noise or took pictures or called anyone. The neighborhood felt peaceful again like it did before Diane moved in. I could sit on my porch with coffee in the morning without worrying about what she would complain about that day. My kids rode their bikes in the driveway and used sidewalk chalk and ate popsicles outside, and nobody cared. Rich put a "for rent" sign in Diane's front yard, but this time he said he was being really careful about who he picked. He ran background checks on everyone who applied and called their previous landlords, and asked the neighbors what they thought before he made any decisions. He said he learned his lesson about just renting to anyone who had the money. The house sat empty for about 6 weeks while Rich looked for the right people. 2 months after Diane left, a moving truck showed up at her old house on a Saturday morning. A family got out of a car behind the truck, and they had 2 teenage daughters who looked around 15 and 17. The mom came over to my house that afternoon carrying a plate of brownies that were still warm. She said her name was Jennifer, and they were so excited to move into such a nice neighborhood with lots of families. I invited her in, and we talked for a while about the street and the schools, and she said her daughters were looking forward to having younger kids around to babysit. I told her welcome to the neighborhood, and I meant it. It felt good to have normal people living next door again. 6 months later, I was sitting on my porch on a Saturday afternoon watching my kids play tag in the yard with Jennifer's daughters. Sebastian's beagle was running around with them trying to figure out the game and barking every time someone got tagged. The sun was shining and kids were laughing and everything felt right. I thought about how close we came to letting one angry person ruin what we had here. Diane almost made me afraid to let my kids play in their own yard. She almost made me feel like a bad parent for letting them be normal kids. But we stood up to her as a neighborhood, and we got our peace back. My kids were happy and healthy and playing outside like they should be. The street was quiet except for normal kid noises. I learned that bullies only win if you let them, and sometimes the best thing you can do is stand together with your neighbors and refuse to back down.